Hey Indian Creek 8th grade students, it's Professor Blazek, and I'm back once again with part 5 in our video series on the American Civil War, looking at emancipation and fighting the war. Now, the guiding question that I would like you to keep in mind as you watch this video is, what were the effects of the Emancipation Proclamation, and how did the war impact the economies and people of both sides? Now, let's discuss once more Lincoln's viewpoints and hesitations on slavery, because up until the Battle of Antietam, ending slavery had not been made a major focus in the war. Remember, President Lincoln's main concern when he was speaking publicly was to save the Union. Now, keep in mind that personally Lincoln was opposed to slavery, but he understood the dangers in making that viewpoint public, so he chose instead to just make his public statement that he was only focused on saving the Union. Lincoln feared that taking any actions against slavery would anger the border states, which, remember, the border states were areas of land that the Union could not really afford to lose. And he also thought that this would make the war less popular. Remember that the war was already less popular in the North than it was in the South, and he felt that if he made slavery the main priority over saving the Union, this would cause some issues within the minds of many people in the North, because a lot of them were focused mainly on bringing the Confederate States back into the Union and keeping the country whole. So he was afraid that prioritizing slavery over saving the Union would just sort of turn people in the North away from following him and continuing to support the war. So Lincoln in August of 1862 would say, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." So this just kind of reinforces the public message that Lincoln was giving, which again was just that his main focus is saving the Union. He did not want slavery spreading into new territories, but if he could bring the Confederate States back into the Union, he would be able to live with allowing slaves who were already enslaved to continue to do so. Again, just reinforcing that saving the Union was his number one priority publicly early on in the Civil War. But this would actually change because Lincoln realized that slavery was really helping the Southern war effort, because all of these slaves who were doing this manual labor in raising crops generated a lot of money and was still the main trade materials that the South could use. And also because slaves were doing all of this physical labor, this helped to free up a large number of Southerners to go and enlist and fight in the Civil War. So it was also contributing to the enlistment numbers in the Confederate Army. And in addition, Lincoln realized that taking a public stance against slavery would make getting support from Great Britain and France by the South far less likely, because this really would not look good for Great Britain and France to take the side of and support a country who is now fighting against the abolition of slavery. And remember that this was a main goal of the South from the outset of the war, was to try and gain support from Great Britain and France. And Lincoln knew that if Great Britain and France began to send money and men and materials to the South, this could be similar to what had happened in the Revolutionary War when France came to the aid of the 13 colonies. So what Lincoln decided to do was give the Emancipation Proclamation, and he did so on January 1st of 1863. He signed the document which said that all persons held as slaves within any state in rebellion against the United States shall be thenceforward and forever free. The first public action looking to end the institution of slavery. But what's important to keep in mind is that if you look at the language used in the quote above, this law only applied to slave states. It only applied to people who were being held in states that were in rebellion against the United States. So the Emancipation Proclamation didn't technically free anybody because, remember, the Confederate States were no longer following the laws of the Union. They were following their own laws. But what Lincoln hoped was that giving this Emancipation Proclamation would reach the ears and the minds of enslaved peoples in the South, and he hoped that this would inspire slaves to run away from their slaveholders or rebel in some form. Now, the results of the Emancipation Proclamation were that Great Britain and France did decide to withhold aid from the South. They did not come and support the South, which was a major blow to the Confederacy because, remember, they had really been counting on this aid to help them make up for the fact that their army was smaller, their economy was weaker. And over time, after the Emancipation Proclamation, about 1/6 of the slaves in the South would actually flee and head to the North. And many African Americans, both who already lived in the North or who had escaped themselves, would act as guides and spies in helping others escape. You might have heard of Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad as being a prime example of this, because the Underground Railroad was a network of transportation designed to help slaves escape to the North. These could be safe houses or other methods of helping people move in ways that would allow slaves to get from the Confederacy back into the Union. This also made Southerners very consistently afraid of slave rebellions, and this was something that would happen a number of times in the South and just became one more thing that slaveholders had to worry about. So if you look at the effects of the Emancipation Proclamation, you can see the effects listed on the left for the South that we already discussed. And in the North, we talked about the fact that escaped slaves would help others escape by acting as guides and spies. But as the war went on, Congress would also pass a law that allowed African Americans to serve in the war, and about 200,000 would enlist. Now, obviously, they served in solely African American regiments, but there were still a number of phenomenal actions of courage and bravery that these African American soldiers would show in their service in the war. In addition, enslaved workers who were still in the South would become overjoyed to see and hear about the fact that African Americans were being allowed to serve in the Union Army. Again, just another way of perhaps inspiring rebellion or uprising in enslaved peoples who still existed in the South after the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, as the war dragged on, the original enthusiasm in fighting the war would wane. And this was because of a number of reasons. Now, wounded soldiers would overwhelm medical facilities. The medical technology was not very advanced, and the number of men who were wounded just continued to pile up, to the point that men would sometimes have to wait a full day or longer to receive any attention when they were wounded in battle. And during the entirety of the Civil War, about 1 in 11 soldiers in the Union and 1 in 8 soldiers in the Confederacy would actually run away from the war, either due to growing tired of fighting or, just growing tired of being tired and hungry all of the time, or just, losing interest in serving in this war. And Southern troops were especially impacted by this fact because, remember, they were not as well supplied as the North, so they were the ones who really experienced lack of food and lack of supplies during their service. So these were just a few of the challenges faced by soldiers who were fighting in the Civil War. Now, due to this fact, enlistment in both armies would decline as the war went on. There were fewer and fewer people who were signing up to fight. And so both the Union and Confederacy would pass draft laws during the war, but they both made allowances where a man who was drafted could find a substitute, or in the North only, men could also pay a tribute to the government to avoid having to serve if they were drafted. But perhaps more importantly was that, remember, the war is far less accepted and far less supported than it originally was. So when these draft laws were put in place, both the North and the South would see people riot against these laws because, again, the war was losing favor and people did not want to be drafted into a war that they did not support or were not interested in. Now, let's look a little bit at the impact of the war on the economies of the North and South, because both sides would have to borrow large amounts of money to fight the war and would suffer from inflation. And inflation is a term that means prices were going up faster than wages were going up. So, for example, $5 at the beginning of the war was worth far more than $5 in the middle or the end of the war, because both sides were really struggling to finance the war, so they would drive up prices, and because wages weren't going up, people could not afford many of the goods that they once had. Now, despite this fact, the North's economy would actually boom during the war because there was a steady need for supplies, for food and other war items, so the farms and factories in the North actually did very well overall because they had the technology and advances to keep up with this demand. Now, on the other side, the Southern economy really struggled. Remember, they had already been the weaker economy to begin with, but the North's blockade, which we discussed in an earlier video, and the destruction of much of the Southern land, because this is where the majority of the fighting was happening, really caused the South to experience shortages of many items. The South just really felt the impact of the war far more than the North would. Now, women played important roles in the Civil War as well, and there were a number of different roles that they would play. There were some women who would act as spies, such as Rose O'Neal Greenhow and Belle Boyd. They would also act as nurses, and some famous nurses in the war included Clara Barton, who was pictured on the right. She was actually the founder of the American Red Cross. Dorothy Dix was another. She's the woman pictured on the left, and Sally Tompkins. And then there were some women who would actually disguise themselves as men and serve in combat, although this was very rare. But one woman who is an example of this was named Loretta Janetta Velasquez, who served in the Confederate Army early in the war and then would actually become a spy later on. So we will end the video once more with the guiding question, and I will be back soon with the final part in our series on the American Civil War. Until then, this has been Professor Blazek, and I will see you next time.